Up next, we've got David Deacon from Lunar Animation. David has a decade of experience in animation and video game development. He's now one of the founders of Lunar Animation and heads technical aspects of production. He's going to walk us through a TV spot called Mountain Men, Nature's Thread, project Lunar Animation recently completed.
Cool. Well, thanks for the intro. That worked pretty well for me. So I'm from Lunar Animation. We're an animation studio based up in Sheffield. We've been going for about 4 years now. We've generally been working on commercials, game trailers, animated shorts, and kind of anything that's sort of generally CG animation. This is our space. This is a little low. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce ourselves with our showreel. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an insight into the variety of things, the variety of kind of stuff we do. It's very much not in the VFX world, very much just solely in animation. This is how our pipeline looks like at the moment. Everything's animated over in Maya, baked down to Alembic caches. Effects are all done in Houdini, any kind of geometry processing. Then it all gets brought back into Maya and V-Ray, rendered, and then composited through a Nuke. So bringing it to the project, so Roger approached us back in September. They're an LA-based studio and have worked with the History Channel quite a lot on Mountain Men and doing promotional spots for the show specifically. And it was all around the Nature's Thread is kind of the tagline of the show. And it was all based around connecting to the environment. Everything's going to be made out of fabric, burlap, and yarn. And these are some of the concepts they'd done for the different elements that were going to be in the environment. They'd provided us with different material references. So everything was going to be made of these kind of very naturalistic fibres. Houdini was going to be obvious from the outset, from getting the storyboard from those guys, that we're going to do a lot of growth effects and that type of thing. The spot was going to be 25 seconds long of our CGI, and then they were going to do 5 seconds of the tagline at the end, and then they provide that to us. They got us excited about doing the project, and then told us we had 4 weeks to make it. So it was going to be pretty tight. We were only a small team. So I'll play the spot now.
I love land. You know, it's the source of life. The land is no different than my arm or my hand. You know, it's just a part of my existence. Out here in nature, basically, you realize that you're connected with the whole world. You're a part of it. It's a part of you. It all ties together. It all is bound into one story.
So it's all really quick, and I've got 4 characters to get in there. So everything we were doing, we had to make sure it was very readable, and like all that kind of stuff. So this is all 16.5 based. It was announced literally as we were finishing the project, and was like, oh man, that would have made it so much easier. Okay, so one of the first things I wanted to highlight was the guide process node. But how I used it was generally not through the traditional grooming process. It's this massive HDA that does a whole load of stuff. So it's just not for grooming. It's got some really nice, powerful mask generation options in there. You can stack multiple operations inside a single node. It's super fast, and generally you don't need to use any vex when playing around with it. I generally use it across these 3 types. The set length, which is kind of like a supercharged carve node, so you can chuck in loads of different curves and multiply them down randomly, increase the length, cut them, anything like that. Then the frizz node is generally kind of how I use it in a sense of like a mountain sop. But again, it's got all those kind of powerful masking nodes built in, and then the bend sop is what it is. It bends stuff. So I'm going to go over a little demo of a setup we had to make, because we didn't have very long to set any of these effects up, so there was a lot of reuse of different little tools we were making along the way. So this is kind of a demo that I'd created after the project to try and display. So this is kind of like a general curve setup. We're doing a lot of this kind of growth yarn type effects, and this is a simple kind of setup where I'm taking an input curves, and the input is just a pointed vection setup using a curl noise. Yeah. So that's just using a velocity curl noise field on the scattered points from the grid. And then the general setup was quite low poly count, but I needed a lot more points for the yarn setup. And then this is highlighting the first guide process node, where I'm taking all those input curves, and I can just quickly, you can see how fast it runs over this number of points, is just essentially just cutting them down using the set length. We've got a little wrangle here, which is setting p-scale across the length of the curve. I'm sure there's more efficient ways of writing that, but it works. And then this is then fed into a primitive wrangle, so it's running across each of those points. And I've got in each of those curves, it is then running through this subnet, which is using the sweep node, and the sweep node has got the transform using attributes, so I'm essentially creating a transform for each of the points along the curve, and that just allows me to take a circle, which essentially is kind of like stamping along the curve, and I'm twisting each along the way. It's also taking into account that p-scale attribute, so you can change the length of the curve, the tightness of the knit along the curve. And it's a circle that's getting essentially stamped, so it's really easy for me to increase the number of divisions, which then in turn increases the number of twists along the curve. And then the ID attribute, which is then plugged into the add sop to create the final poly curves. Moving along. So guide process node, this is the same animation as before, but you can see now that it's running across all 3 of the curves that have just been generated from the subnet. Again, I'm using the guide process node to just randomly adjust each of the curves length, which allows it just kind of feathering that edge, so you're not getting that kind of really hard cut. And then this is me just highlighting the frizz node and then some of its masking, so you can just essentially just mix up the end edges. And then I'm doing this in quite a lot, so I create a random color attribute for each curve, so it's just much easier to see the definition of each one, and then just say in p-scale again for the polywire. So moving on to the character development, Roger had managed to do a lot of concept art for us. The pre-production was pretty much worked out before we were involved, which was great. And they were even able to provide us with base character meshes. So we essentially took them from this state, and these are the 4 characters, and then do the look dev process. We were doing a look dev process in Maya. One thing we wanted to try out right away was V-Ray scans, which are, if you haven't used them, they're kind of not just a texture, but they include like lighting information and how light should react to the surface. They quite quickly gave us that kind of non-CGI look, quite kind of out of the box. One thing we did find though is that they were a little bit too clean. So all the characters went through kind of a substance painter pass where we were able to mix up and augment the scans on top with a bit of grunge and that kind of stuff. The base grooms were done over in Maya, only through the time we had to do it, and we had Maya artists available. So this is kind of a basic X-Gen groom, which was then spat through into Houdini using the Alembic output. The red guides there are actually going through the hair process node. The rest is going to go through a kind of a separate pipeline. And then this is the kind of basic setup we've got. So here I'm actually just painting a little mask, which I then plug straight into the density attribute, which is then picked up by the hair generate node later. And then this is general setup. So these are the actual guide curves that are coming over from Maya. They're just isolated out. And then this is a fairly simple groom where I'm actually just diving in there and adjusting. That's the density attribute. Getting plugged in, and then just adjusting the groom because it's just going to make it a little bit more lively. But where it kind of gets a bit more interesting is a little further on, where that same setup that I was showing you before. I actually want to highlight one thing here, is that if you are trying to do any kind of post-processing on the hair generate node, just flicking this hair generate over to SOP geometry, because as soon as you press render, you'll get nothing because it's trying to generate a mantra render time. That's the one there. So this is the same setup as before. Create my random color attributes, resampling. Setting the yarn width. And then this is the same HDA as we said before, which was converting each of the curves into the kind of like twisty yarn. So that's for like every hair is now a twisty curve, which you couldn't do through your typical fur setup all easily less. And then I'm just adjusting the width again, just to you can just about see it where it's kind of like a bit more of a flayed edge. Skips ahead. Yeah. And then I'm using the guide process nodes at the end to just chip a little bit off each of the new strands, makes it look a little bit more interesting. And then it goes into the standard polywire setup. As I mentioned before, a lot of the elements weren't generated through a groom, but still used some of the grooming tools. So these are the braces. And they would generate, is that planes? Yeah. So they were some standard curves that came in over from Maya, and then merged them on top of each other just to duplicate increase the number of curves, then create essentially a random offset for each curve. And it kind of gives this kind of like, fills out the mass of the brace. And then this is a simple kind of prototype for how I was going to generate the growth of the animation, essentially just reducing the length of each one of them. They obviously then sent through the yarn generation, and then using that same wrangle to adjust the length. And that works quite well, because now you're getting double the amount of strands, so you're kind of getting more interesting look straight away. So this is kind of like the final output of the jacket, and then converted over to the poly wires. Oops. So one of the reasons I was having all of the rainbow colored point primitives was useful in more ways, because I was sending it over as a color attribute that V-Ray could pick up as vertex colors, and then instead of me locking down any of the kind of colors inside Houdini, it allowed the look dev artists to define that by essentially remapping the colors into these gradient ramps. And then these are the final character evolves. And then one for the second character. So you can really see how the hair is picking up that random color, but also because each strand is got its own random color, you kind of get these nice hairs where it's like two colors wrapped up in the same beard, in the same strand. And these are the 4 characters. Okay, moving on to some of the character effects. Tom's jacket was the main growth effect in this shot. It was meant to be made up from the actual grass that was floating through the environment and forming his jacket. One of the things I needed to do initially was, it was all based around a base animation cache that was kind of rough. And the skin geometry from Maya was a very basic position that flowed behind him. I then took a Maya cloth solve, which was kind of broken in places. So just being able to use sops to clean that up was really useful. So you can kind of see there's problem intersections around the arms, but the actual flow behind him works quite well. So just using the rest positions and then painting some masks. Yes. And then just using a point wrangle to be able to merge these two together. It's something that would have been just a pain to do in Maya. Or I could have either spent more time cleaning up cloth sims or putting rigs in for animators. Neither would have been an ideal solution. And then the second thing I did was I wanted to add a bit more energy and life into the bottom of the cloth. So I ended up making a kind of a fake wind, which was essentially just using a point VOP with a curl noise that was kind of offset through the x-axis, and then that was masked again using that same point wrangle. The mask essentially I generated earlier. Just looks a little bit more interesting. So the way I was wanting to control the actual main formation of the jacket was through an infection system. It kind of allowed me to I could basically select exactly where I wanted the growth to start from, and then it would progress across the jacket. So this is just setting up bringing the cache, scattering the points across it, and then using the group node to just really simply select exactly which points were going to be set as active as these initial points. One of the things I'm highlighting next is kind of a clustering system. So one of the things I wanted to do is to really specifically define where the grass was flowing from or flowing to. And I needed to set up a cluster attribute for that. But one of the things I did was, which is quite nice, is the cluster points is like a Voronoi effect. So you get these very, very hard straight lines. So if you deform your points before you put them into the cluster node and then restore the positions afterwards, you kind of get these nice broken up to edges. And then just moving the points around, made it really kind of quick, easy to define exactly which area was which. And then there's a fairly simple attribute transfer style setup for the actual SOP solver that increases the infection. The yellow areas are the points that have just been converted to active, which I use later to drive the actual particle system. So I also wanted to have like an underlying structure of the jacket. So these were again just made over in Maya, brought into Houdini, and essentially just edge selections converted to curves, just mirrored over. They kind of got a little bit out of sync on one side, so just ray swapped it from the rest geometry that's been subdivided. The curves were all really long. I needed them to be sliced up. So I created a very simple setup to just essentially slice them in half, merge them back together. It's just using the carve node. So I often do a lot of the stuff at the origin. It's, you don't have to think about the actual animation while you're working. So this is taking the infection system again from before, attribute transferring that to the curves. That's obviously at the point level at the moment, so I promote that up to the primitive level as the CD attribute. Just then create a length, and then using this point wrangle, primitive wrangle, sorry, adjust the length of each curve, and then that is just basically multiplying down the length based on that color from the infection system. I did a little bit more post-processing with the guide nodes. So using the guide node to do actually nothing at all apart from cull the super short curves, which worked really well. And then add in a little bit of a frizz, which kind of broke up that kind of really kind of rigid structure. And then moving ahead a little bit is just then moving that into the kind of the animation space, bringing in that cleaned up geometry cache. And then that is then the animated cache. One thing I also need to do, I've been aware of throughout this entire project, was making sure you've got good motion vectors. If you've got anything that's kind of like point orders changing every frame, you need a good way of generating those motion point velocities and then transferring those over. It was generally a pain all the way through the project, every effect. We needed to manage those motion vectors. And so in this case, we just used it on the original cloth and then transferred it across. And then that went through a simple polywire, which became the final mesh. So this effect was kind of one of the key components of this shot. And it was these kind of big grass streams that were flowing to his jacket. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to wrangle a pop network to get a particle to land on a specific frame at a specific position, and you end up balancing all these different forces and trying to still create an interesting motion. So I took a sort of a different approach with this and reversed the animation. So he was then walking backwards, and particles were leaving his jacket. Look how I set that up. So again, bringing the infection system across. This point, I'm just deforming it and pushing it in slightly into the mesh using the peak node by modifying that animation. So that's it on the surface. Then turning that back on, it kind of crunches those initial source positions in slightly. One of the first things I do is I just transfer the normal attribute across, because I do need that later for setting up motion velocity, initial velocities. And then just isolating those yellow points, which are the points that have just been activated. And then I do this all the time. You're just using CD to visualize stuff. And this is the point where I'm just reversing time. So that cache is now running backwards. I had way too many points, so just deleting a few of those, or the majority of them. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So moving to this is how I set up the initial velocities. Nothing particularly fancy, just taking the normal, multiplying it up, and then adding a bit of an offset in X. That was just to kind of get them flowing in the same direction as the wind would have been going. Get them to fire off the surface as well. So this is the pop net. It's really simple. Just bringing them emitting from every point, and then adding a little bit of a random wind force. But each of the curves were fed down a curve force SOP. But this is where I'm using that cluster attribute, because if I didn't and tried to just work with a radius of each of the curves forces, I very much ran into a case of just overlapping forces, and it became kind of a big mess, and it wasn't particularly art directable at all. And using curve forces as well, one of the advantages of that is that I could get an animator to go and maybe some nice curves in Maya, and I didn't really have to think about exactly how and where those things should go. And they were tweaked a little bit in Houdini, just kind of see the little stack for each curve. They were then just cached out, tiny little files really, and then reversing the time back to kind of the normal state, so everything was progressing forwards. Then using the kind of standard trail SOP to kind of duplicate each point over time, and the adds SOP to using the particles ID to generate it. And then this is me again using the frizz node outside of grooming, just to kind of crunch it up a little bit. Okay, again, these curves are obviously just straight lines at the moment, and we need to send them through the kind of yarn generation tool set again. The only really modification I made to this setup was I wanted to have the curves kind of like looser, and as they were kind of flowing to his jacket, kind of tightening up and really shrinking down as they were attaching to the jacket. So I was able to use the age attribute that had come through from the particle system, and then adjusting the width based on those. You can kind of see each strand. Pretty much it. And then this is the end where I'm going to create a random attribute, random color for each of the curves as well. It was a little bit of a different setup just because the curves weren't a consistent number across the entire length of the shot. The fur system itself for the actual jacket was very much a basic fur setup, just using the input guides from Maya, then send them through the deform, grabbing the rests and the animation cache that I'd cleaned up from earlier, and then send them through the groom deform node. So you can see all my different simulations. I ended up doing it this way because the guide simulate node has got a load of caching built into it. So I'm able to just like alt drag one of these nodes. If I've got the naming convention set up right, I can then just alt drag one of these, change some parameters, and fire off another simulation in the background. I was using an iMac Pro 10 core at the time, so it was fairly easy to just run a couple of these at the background at the same time, go make a drink, come back, and just evaluate which was the best. And it looks like I ended up making 10 of them. Yeah, so that was the last one. I ended up not doing any kind of conversions at the end. So this is where I was at the end. So this is the kind of the final groom through the simulation, then through the yarn generation, and then the infection system was used again. It's just visualized there, and then that's used to reduce the length of each of those curves in turn. And I probably should have explained at the beginning, it was easier to do it that way than trying to have the groom grow over time during the simulation. So it was kind of much easier to do it as a post effect rather than simulating growing curves while simulating the hair. And then this is kind of like a little breakdown of some work in progress. That was an old animation cache, and then this is like a work in progress render, and then back to the actual final shot. So moving on to some of the Marty's effects. So his jacket wasn't as complex in terms of the growth structure, but it needed to be connected directly to the tree that was behind him. Kind of this whole, coming back to the idea that these guys are connected to the world. There was a lot more kind of like dynamic wind in the scene, and the kind of snow-covered ground. His jacket and hair and beard were simulated with a Y solver through this standard groom setup, but the trees themselves were actually kind of like a procedural noise-based approach, but the two are connected. So this is running through that setup now. So first, based on the trees, so each tree was essentially just a static load of curves, and then merged together. And this is just highlighting some more of the great masking options on the curve, on the generate and the guide process up, and it's this absolute length attribute. It's really useful, especially when you're kind of working with curves that are all different lengths, and you actually just want the longer curves to be affected and not necessarily the curve based on its entire length. And then this is that kind of procedural curl noise being advected through, and then using the bend mode on the guide process node. And that kind of just getting them flowing in the direction of the wind. And again, you can see how easy it is to sort of tweak the masks on that type of stuff. So then again, that's that setting the width to kind of spray out the edges. So it loosens off towards the ends, and then I'm just splitting as many as the curves that I wanted to actually connect to his jacket. Just manually selected, and then the rest just goes through the same setup as I had set up before, where it's kind of converted to the yarn and then into a poly wire. Okay, so this is going to go into just connecting the two together. So I'm bringing in the jacket simulation and the tree from before. I'm doing the same split, so I'm going, okay, I need X number of curves from his jacket and then the same from the tree. They're then getting the same attribute made across them. So then using the for each loop, and then because they've got the same attribute, I'm getting one of each in the loop. So I'm using the curve U attribute and then using the fuse based on that to fuse them together and just smoothing it out. And then it's quite nice because I'm using the input animation, I get this kind of jiggle in the middle regardless for free. And then using the frizz node, just adjusting the mask to kind of add that kind of bit more interest in the middle. And then using that mask propagates through the network, so I can then utilize that again to just pull those curves down that were just feeling like they were a bit too tight, and just kind of add in a bit of fake gravity. So one of the things I did for the snow on the ground, Initially, I tried just growing a load of fur and making it curly to make this kind of cotton wool effect. Didn't really look like cotton wool. So what I ended up found was just kind of creating a ball of cotton wool and using the guide process nodes again to create that. So just taking a line, mixing it up with the frizz node. It's kind of coarse at the moment, so I just resample that and smooth it. And then use the bend node to just kind of twist that around into kind of a curl. And resampled it because it was, if I was going to make a lot of these, I needed it not to be as mental. And then just making an interesting shape, taking a sphere, squashing it down, using a mountain. I wanted to scatter into the surface, not on the surface, so I made a VDB out of it. Tried to make that look interesting. And then just setting up a random n attribute for the, so that each of the points was going to be randomly rotated when it was copied to points. And then that's then just set to bounding box because it did kill my viewport quite badly. And then I just setting up a simple scarf I made a really basic terrain. And then I'm just using the mask by feature node to get a point mask to essentially kind of copy stamp these guys too. And then that all went out to V-Ray for Maya. And it's going to have a bit of a progress reel on it. So that's going to have the initial one with no effects. This is the raw render. And then the kind of raw render with all the final comp shot. Moving on to the first shot, which was this kind of formation of the boot. Initially I thought I could just take the curves from the look dev and just send it through one big kind of carve node, and it kind of looked a bit boring. So what I ended up doing was creating, essentially kind of splitting out each of the individual kind of wraps of the boot, and these came over from Maya as curves and as surfaces. And I would use the surface normals in the kind of deformation of the boot. And I made a kind of like a little setup that made this really art directable and easy to manipulate. So I could easily kind of define the start point of when the curves would start to appear, and easily just when they'd actually reach their full length. And then as I was progressing through each of the segments, I was going in and modifying the HDA to add more attributes and more controls, and then they would then propagate back to the other guys that I'd already set up and adjust those. So you could then pull them up higher as they were growing. I could, you can see it, pull it up higher off the surface, and then also adjust the offset for each of the individual curves as it ran along the surface. And then so this is the actual final generation of the boot, just from a static camera. You can see here they were actually generating all the geometry all the time, rather than, because I was always splitting off the black areas. And the reason I was doing that is I needed to grow fur on this surface later. So if I had just chopped off all this black geometry, I would have been having a change in point order that was then running through the groom setup, which would cause the point order to change and everything would start flickering around. So it was always kind of like keep everything until you don't need it and then delete it. This is kind of looking at that. So that's all the geometry all the time, and then the kind of clipped geometry, which I'd kept around, and then I could grow fur on it, which was then moving on to the final render and then the final shot. Another example of keeping it simple early on and using the curve tools, the guide process node to make things look more interesting, was this example where I'm using the wire solver to just connect his arm to the ground, but then instead of simulating these kind of complex twisty curves, was just then augmenting that with kind of like a post-process effect. I kind of wanted to highlight a few of the assets we made through the Houdini. So I was taking that's hero tree asset that was made over in Speed Tree, and being able to output the different caches through the actual polygon geometry and the curves that Speed Tree can output, and then using those through kind of HDA to be able to then generate the tree and keep all that nice wind animation you can get out of Speed Tree, and generate a few of those different assets. I'd highlight some of the other work that was done by some of the guys where it was some nice leaf animations that you don't see because they're so small, and then some mushrooms. We even managed to make a woolen shotgun. And then this is me just playing the final spot again.
I love land. You know, it's the source of life. The land is no different than my arm or my hand. You know, it's just a part of my existence. Out here in nature, basically, you realize that you're connected with the whole world. You're a part of it. It's a part of you. It all ties together. It all is bound into one story.
So, thank you. So I'd just like to thank Side Effects for inviting us down. Also, I want to shout out to Roger. They were really great to work with on this project, and it came out great for the amount of time we had to work on it. And obviously the team, and then you guys for coming and listening to me. One thing I want to mention is we're hiring. We're obviously up in Sheffield, but we're essentially expanding our entire internal team. So I thought I'd mention it. And moving into Q&A.
It's a beautiful part of the country, by the way.
Yeah, it's a lot of nice hills to go walking.
Any questions?
I have a question actually. So I was quite surprised to see the use of the standard fur tools.
Yeah, I mean they're really great for just doing lots of general stuff outside of SOPs, in SOPs.
Yeah,
actually.
that was really cool. I was gonna ask, did you have any? So there were some places where I wouldn't have thought that that would work.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any problems with like, for example, like the frizz node? I think it refuses to frizz like the root point, the first point, or something like that. Or did that all just work? No problems.
It might be. I didn't notice it.
Okay.
It was obviously generally working along the length of the curve and frizzing the end more than I was the top. I did double check this morning. I was like, can it frizz everything, or can it? No, so it didn't do geometry and it didn't do points that are not connected to each other.
Right.
But in general, it worked pretty well, and it's stable as well across time and kind of moving things through space, which was great.
Yeah, that was cool. Really nice results. That looked
Thanks,
beautiful.
Man. I mean, it was very much. All the setups were like maybe a day, 2 days, because it was just such a tight turnaround. But I think that's it.
Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, a couple more.
Hey, you mentioned that it's obviously quite a quick turnaround in 4 weeks, and you've done a lot, as you've shown us. How much was done specifically for this versus stuff you brought over from projects you've worked on before?
It was really kind of fresh. We hadn't done any kind of like yarn fur generation. Well, we've done a bit of fur work, but that was very much furry cats. But no, it was all from fresh, really. I mean, I was very much leveraging the kind of great Houdini community. There was so many great tutorials out there for doing this type of stuff, and then it was very much going, okay, I've seen that effect there. I'm sure that I can create a similar setup to create this effect here. So it was kind of like standing on the community was how we made it. This work.
You like jump on Odd Force and stuff like that.
That type of stuff, yeah. I mean, there was definitely snippets that I've copied and pasted off Odd Force that was specifically for like, oh, you need to do a random carve across loads of nodes. Before I'd found the guide process node I could do it on that, I was ended up using it across, just grabbing stuff from places like that worked really well.
Amazing work, thank you.
Hi.
Yeah.
Where am I looking?
What was the average render time Obviously, you must have rendered in Mantra because you used for procedural.
No, sorry, we didn't use. Everything was over in Maya with V-Ray, so it was a challenge to make sure we could get everything across, and there was definitely caveats to bringing things over. We had to manage our own motion velocities. We had a lot of big cache files that we were saving out, a lot of Alembic files. Average render times, to be honest, we used a progressive renderer. V-Ray has a resumable render, so we were sending things through quite rough. There's a kind of saves out a resumable file, and we then had a kind of like a deadline set where we could go, okay, you can run for an hour, and then we get a noisy render, and then you can run for 2 more hours, get a bit cleaner result, and then but not throwing away that first hour. So that's kind of how we progressed, and then we weren't rendering final shots. Allowed us to kind of go, okay, this render's a little bit noisy. We'll send it through a couple more times to just kind of clean it up.
So about 2 hours, 3 hours per frame or something?
Depending on the computer, I think some probably maybe were around 6 hours at the longest.
For render, you mean?
Yeah, for the final render.
Okay. And don't you think it would have been easier to do it in Mantra because you will use the for procedural power, which
potentially. I mean, it's definitely something we're looking at in terms of where to render these type of effects. I mean, we've done explosions and rendered those in Mantra, and then comped them in through deep process because everything else has been rendered in V-Ray from Maya. But at the moment, we're not set up to render. We haven't got line art. It's just the working inside of Houdini.
So you cache the whole hair.
Yeah, it
into
made
geometry.
big files. I'm not going to lie, it made real big files.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Thank you.
Other questions? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, thank you, David.
Cheers, man. Thank you.